Welcome and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants are on a listen-and-only mode until the question-and-answer session of today's conference. At that time, you may press star 1 if you'd like to ask a question. Today's conference is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. I'd like to turn the call over to your speaker. Linda, you may begin.
Good afternoon. For those of you joining on the East and West Coast, thank you for joining us for our webinar on the Export Management Compliance. I'm pleased to note that we have more than 55 people registered for this webinar today. My name is Linda Abrazizi. I'm an International Trade Specialist for the Marketing Communications Office for the U.S. Commercial Service at the Department of Commerce. This webinar is being brought to you in cooperation by the U.S. Commercial Service and the Bureau of Industry and Security. I would like to welcome all participants in the export community who are joining us all across the United States to learn about effective export management and compliance guidelines so your company can implement export strategies. In this webinar, you will learn how your company can implement safeguards from the Export Management Compliance Program. In addition, you will learn how effective export management compliant guidelines can minimize the risk of an export violation. In a moment, I'll turn this presentation over to Thomas Androukonis, Director of the Export Management Compliance Division of the Office of Exporter Services for the Bureau of Industry and Security. He will be available at the end of this presentation to answer your questions. Contact information will also be provided to everyone at the end of the presentation. For those of you who just joined, you can still log into the webinar by entering the URL website and passcode per instructions that were sent to you by email. And we do have a few housekeeping details to make sure everyone gets the most benefit from this afternoon's webinar. You'll be able to hear this presentation via your telephone, and you can view it simultaneously via your computer. So if you are not hooked up through both, please take a moment to do this. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties during this webinar, please press star 0 anytime during the presentation. We will be taking written and voice questions. To ask a written question, we do invite you to type in your questions as they occur to you during this presentation. On the upper left-hand side of your computer, you will see an icon with the letters Q&A. If you put your mouse's cursor over this icon, you can type in your questions during this presentation. We will compile these questions and present them as many times allows during this presentation. Type questions which are not answered during this webinar due to time constraints will receive a personal answer via email. We will open the presentation for voice questions. To ask a voice question, please press star 1 and the operator will assist you with your question. Also, in addition, for those of you who want a copy of the PowerPoint presentation slides from this webinar, you can get them by going to the icon on the upper right-hand side of the computer where there are 3 pieces of paper overlapping one another. If you put your mouse's cursor over this icon, you can actually download the PowerPoint presentation slides to your computer or to a folder. In addition, all listeners will be provided with information for any individual file counseling, expert research, or market research. And for those of you who just joined and logged in, you can still join our Internet conference. And now I'd like to introduce live online the Director of the Export Management Compliance Division of the Office of Export Services for the Bureau of Industry and Security, Thomas Androukonis. Thomas, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Linda. It's great to be with you this afternoon for those on the East Coast, and still good morning, I guess, for those out there on the West Coast. This is Tom Androukonis, and as Linda said, I head up the Export Management and Compliance Division within the Office of Exporter Services. The title slide that you see in front of you does not include my phone number, but let me give you that now so that you have that for future reference or phone calls. I'm at 202-482-6393, and my email is tandruko@bis.doc.gov. Well, I got to tell you, it's a pleasure to be with you, and I think I don't want to, say it, but I think they may have saved the best for last. I know we've had a lot of webinars this week that have been very instructional and interesting and covered a variety of topics, all of them relevant and important. But within the Office of Exporter Services, one of the things that we've found to be helpful is that once you have that body of knowledge and experience and know your products, your regulations, and how to obtain classifications and licenses and understand the ins and outs of export controls, you also need to have some kind of strategy or some kind of program within your organization, whether that's a company, a university, what have you, to ensure that you comply with these export administration regulations. And so within our organization, we've worked closely with our export enforcement arm and with the exporting community to learn what are some of the issues that have come up previously in our export violations that we've uncovered, where maybe there was an issue or a problem that could have been, avoided had a better system or strategy or compliance program been in place. So together, we've kind of come up with the effective elements for a compliance program, and as any definition or any program needs, you have to have some kind of definition of what is it. And really, for us, this is our definition of an effective compliance program defined. It needs to have really both kind of standards of conduct and policy that says what employees are expected to do, plus kind of written guidelines or procedures that tells very specifically exactly how to do it and who's going to do it and when, et cetera, and all of those levels of details. It has to include both kind of the higher level of kind of the policy of that organization and specific written guidelines to assist employees to understand what's expected. Now, and we've gotten asked this many times, how can a compliance program, be helpful to my organization? Is it required by the Export Administration regulations? And the answer to that, it is not. We don't mandate that companies or organizations have to have a specific and a written export management and compliance program in place. But we highly recommend it because what we've seen is the more successful companies are those that are really into exporting, that are doing a higher volume or expanding in a larger number of exports, that they even see it as a competitive edge, that there's some kind of delivery mechanism that they can be assured of as far as their supplying their customers in their supply chain. So it does give all of these, bullets, the structure, the consistency, and procedures. And it certainly, and we have seen this directly from work with their export enforcement arm, that the companies that do have a strong program have seen very few, if any, violations of these export regulations. And we obviously see it as a smart business strategy. Now, the foundation, and I know Angie and my colleagues earlier this week have spoken about the foundation of the regulations themselves, but I'd be remiss as a compliance person not to say that that is the cornerstone or the base that every export administrator in your company organization needs to have a strong knowledge of the export administration regulations, and it's available in a number of places that are identified here. There's BIS email notification, and Part 732 is a great location for any compliance person that wants to understand how the steps to use that export administration regs. And on our website, there are a number of helpful areas that include some of our past annual reports, information on our seminars and training, our enforcement activities, and on the export administration regulations and getting the most recent updates as well. Going forward into still on the home page, but lower down, one of the things within the last 12 months that we've updated and revised a few times now is under the left area of additional resources is the compliance program assistance. Within that, you'll see a number of things that I think can be helpful to you in developing your compliance program. We've got compliance guidelines of about 140 pages of different templates of things to get you started. So if you're one of those 50-plus people out there on the other end of this line, just beginning to write or continue to write or maybe enhancing your program, there probably are some good tools or suggestions in there to develop your elements further or give you some template language for writing your compliance program. We also have an audit module in there to assist if you're going to do your own internal audit. We also have direct email contact with me and my colleagues and my division so that if you do have a compliance-related question, you can do it right through our website there and send us a question or a query that you might have for your compliance program. There are also other, helpful items over on the right too, as far as some of those publications. So one of the ones that I think are the most interesting or helpful that I hear from compliance people all the time is the Don't Let This Happen to You export enforcement publication, as far as trying to get senior management commitment to apply resources to the program, because sometimes you'll see a competitor of yours that may be identified in there, which certainly gets the attention of senior management. Well, let's take a look at the key elements that Commerce BIS has identified as the kind of the core elements, if you will, of an effective compliance program. And again, this wasn't done in a vacuum of just me and a couple of folks sitting in a room. That we've actually gotten this by benchmarking and visiting and talking with different exporters out there who have developed programs. We've looked at the Nunn-Wolfowitz legislation from before, the Department of Justice sentencing guidelines that they've issued recently that had a number of suggestions as far as what a compliance program should have, as well as working closely with their export enforcement arm and reviewing some of their case histories and files with their special agents to see what things weren't in place that could have been and maybe avoided a violation. So here are the 9 elements as we've identified. And as I say that, think about it in this way too. If you need a 10th element, you can have that. These are the core elements, if you will. If you need an 11th element, some individuals or some companies may need an 11th element. That's fine. Or you may collapse some of these. These are the ones that we've identified. And there's 2 things I'd say. I think our enforcement folks have been trying to be very visible and helpful in saying and offering and including mitigation of any penalties if a company or an organization has these elements in place in a written program and have them implemented. They will receive up to 25% reduction in any administrative fines for an oops if that would happen to take place. So there's an extra incentive in addition to, if you have these elements in place, I'd say you're much less likely to have one of those oopses occur on your end. But these aren't set in stone. These are the ones that we've identified. As I said, if you need a 10th or an 11th element, that's fine. A question often we get, too, is that we have exporters out there that deal with not just EAR or commerce-controlled items, but also State Department or ITAR munitions items. And my suggestion or recommendation to most companies is that it's not necessary that you have 2 separate individual kind of compliance programs, that you can integrate them into one, and actually that would make more sense, I think, for your employees to be able to follow that across the board. Let's get started. Let's talk about these key elements kind of one at a time as we go forward. And as you can see, management commitment we have listed as number 1, and for obvious reasons. As we talked about them here, we felt that management commitment was probably the most key and a critical element, because without it, you pretty much are lost. If you don't have that senior corporate level commitment, it's going to be very difficult for you to get the support and the resources to do your job as an export administrator or compliance person within any kind of organization. So that is key as far as a first element. And the TMC principle, we've kind of come up with this as far as top management commitment, that definitely it does equate to time, money, and concern. Is senior management providing the amount of time and concern and attention to export control compliance? Is it something that does come up at quarterly or monthly meetings? Is it on the agenda? Or is the money there? Is sufficient number of resources applied to develop and implement a compliance program? Is that person or persons that are identified and hired on to be those compliance folks, are they empowered to do what they need to do to be able to stop shipments or release them and get the senior management support? You need that buy-in across the board. And again, on our website, that Don't Let This Happen to You, many folks have shared with me, has been extremely helpful to them as far as kind of obtaining senior management commitment. Kind of going forward and thinking further kind of through this management commitment, these are kind of some of the examples of best practices or the types of things that we've seen where you really have a corporate level of kind of compliance commitment that you see that culture within that corporation. It's a safe environment. It's free of retribution or retaliation. That the commitment to compliance comes first. Always we're going to do the right thing and are exercising due diligence and speaking up to correct situations are always in place before even profit, that we do things the right way here in this organization, and that's the way we do them. We have written procedures in place. And the communication is not just to those couple of export compliance folks, but it's across the board, that other people in the traffic or the sales department or human resources or in the IT section also know that this is how we do things and where do I go if I have a vulnerability, an issue, or a question. Going forward to the second element, continuous risk assessment. And as you think of this in a perfect world, which I know it isn't often, if you were just establishing a corporation, this is basically kind of the order logically I would place these in. And that would be one of the first activities that I would take upon myself, is to say, okay, where are our highest risks in our international trade environment? Where are the potential, the highest vulnerabilities that of the items that we ship, or the customers or the countries that we're dealing with? How can I shore those up? So thinking about kind of your risk, there's a couple of different ways as far as addressing this and preparing yourself to kind of to handle this for your organization best. And again, it is true that risk assessments rarely do conclude that everything is great, everything is wonderful and under control. It really shouldn't, because you're really trying to look at that thing as a risk manager and trying to be prepared to respond if that worst thing does happen, and what are those most potentially likely to go wrong, and what is the action that you're going to take to mitigate that risk, and then adopting a plan to respond to it, and whose role and responsibility is it to respond to that risk. So these are the types of things that we typically see or would like to see in kind of that risk assessment that a company does. Going forward to written operational guidelines, and this to some degree should be a no-brainer, but on the other side of that, I mean, we do work with small, organization, mom and pops, or, 10, 20 people or less, who could have what we kind of describe as kind of tribal knowledge of this is the way we do things. We don't have a large organization. It's not in writing, but I know my responsibilities, and I pretty much can articulate those in this small environment of the office setting we're in here very easily and quickly. I would even say to an organization like that, though, to have something in writing in place that folks know where it is, and they know where to get it on a shared drive or a corporate intranet site that's easily accessible and updatable and can be reviewed like yearly or as things change, it is still important to be completely operational, because in this kind of corporate environment, I've just seen it over the decades I've been with the Bureau, you take on new either commodity lines, or there's new customer bases, or things change. There's acquisitions, mergers, or overseas new subsidiaries that are established. And so to have some kind of written compliance manual we see as key to ensure that your operations are set in stone or paper or electrons and widely distributed. And this is a situation, too, where these written guidelines for these operational ones are probably best to try to do the KISS principle, to keep it as simple as possible, so as different people read this, they understand completely what steps are involved and who does what and when and who's responsible. Because oftentimes that's where we see violations that occurs, a confusion. I thought somebody else was responsible for that. It wasn't clearly identified who was going to be taking care of that. And the fourth element, as you go forward, now that you got the guidelines, what are you going to do? You're going to train folks. You're going to ensure that people are aware of all the parameters of your compliance program, of your system operationally. And to me, for folks that do a lot of training like myself and Angie and Linda, this is something that I think you can have some fun with, to try to be memorable, keep it different. And as you kind of see in the original slide, I said training and awareness. A lot of times especially in larger organizations, it's not just a very specific training. There's a lot of different ways to do it, and sometimes it's just keeping an awareness to be vigilant of, the red flag indicators or different types of transactions or who the point of contact is. So those things are important. We have it in the government a lot where, security or safety is job one, or, you have different, flyers up here in the hallway or something like that. And that's a part of it too, in addition to very formal education or training as well. And the thing to keep in mind in this regard is it needs to be done at different levels for different folks. Obviously, your core export control people are going to need very specific, very detailed, hands-on type of training. The corporate level, as you go up, they're going to need a different kind of maybe very shorter but brief but type of overview of what your program is. And then folks maybe in ancillary or related types of organizations in your company would get a different kind of training. Think about the frequency too. How often does it recur? And how you would do that. And maintaining records of that training. So that's important too. You want to know, excuse me, who was trained, what kind of training they received, and when they did, and who were those individuals. And maintain that in your records too, because that's something that helps protect you as well, to tell your story of how things went. Again, this is kind of, we've talked about a little bit as far as tailoring your approach to the specific audience that you use, and using different methods too. The conferences, webinars, videos, different things like that are extremely effective for folks that are traveling a lot, that may not be able to get into one room because they're not co-located. So you do need to think outside the box a little bit to make sure that you get that message out there as works best for your organization. Here's just a couple in this slide. I wanted to make sure, just give you a couple of different ideas of different programs, examples over there on the right of ways you can make sure that you're getting your message out. And, there's a number of different ways to do it. Again, all of this does require some resources and support from senior management across the board to support any of these programs. Now, here's where the rubber meets the road, as they say, cradle to grave export compliance, security, and screening. This is really where an export administrator, I think, earns their pay, and quite frankly, the expectation from the organization's point of view is that you're going to make sure that everything is running correct. What should happen does happen, and what shouldn't happen doesn't happen on a daily basis, again and again and again. All of those types of risks and mitigating those risks and ensuring that you've got the decisions up front correct. As you've heard, if you've been in some of the previous webinars this week, there's kind of three different things involved. First, you have to know the jurisdiction. Whose jurisdiction does this technology or these items that we're talking about here fall under? Is it under the Commerce Department, the Treasury Department, the State Department? And then once you've determined that, specifically, what's the classification of that item? Is it this export control commodity number or some other number? And then after that, even knowing that, you do need to make a license determination, because it may be an item that is ECCN EAR 99. However, depending on the type of end user or the location or the party, it may still require a license, which may be approved, but you need to get all of that triage done right and up front. And the better you can do that and establish either a matrix or something so that all your sales staff and your employees know, okay, this is what the expectation or the requirements are, the more kind of responsible and they can, as far as the supply chain and delivery, to be able to produce and know, well, this does require a license. Typically, it's taken between 30 and 60 days, and then they know their customer can be advised of that up front, so there's no surprises, through the course of your working with your customers on overseas customers. As well as it says in that last bullet, and I know that is key, once a license is issued, there are conditions on it to either submit reports to the Bureau or to do certain actions or to share different conditions with the end user, things they can or cannot do with that technology or the items that they've received. So it's important that you've got in your systems there and your cradle-to-grave export compliance security and screening process systems to ensure that your customers are getting that information and confirming that they've gotten that information so there's not a left-hand, right-hand coordination issue or problem. The checks and balances are key. I mean, you want to do what makes sense and strike the right balance in your organization. For those freight forwarders, if there's any on the line out there, I tell you, working with their enforcement side, 75% of the violations they basically shared with us could go away if just doing the screening of the countries it's going to and the parties involved, because so many of our violations have come up with individuals who didn't know they were dealing with a party that's listed on the entity list or the denied persons list or the Office of Foreign Assets Controlled Specially Designated Nationals list or one of the State Department debarred lists. And that is key to your operation. And just as a stat, I know I've worked with some consulting firms that have actually done some benchmarking on this. About 52% of exporters, folks that export, do their screening through software programs using different off-the-shelf or software vendors out there, and there's a number to pick from that are very effective. About 27% use like just going through like our website or something like that and do it manually by using List to Check that's available on our website, and then there's a variety of smaller percentage of options here or there. And there's no one size that fits all. If you're a smaller company that exports, once or twice a week, you may not need to or want to, expend that amount of money when it's not necessary, and you have access to, electronic websites like ours that you can check the list. So, but I just share that with you as far as, benchmarks to be aware of. It does need to consider kind of from start to finish, and having this area as far as the cradle to grave as detailed as possible and as clear as possible about the instructions about, all right, Sam is going to do A, Sally is going to do B, and this is how it works. Also think in this area as far as screening, if you make custom items where maybe you receive an order and it may be a few months before that goes out, these lists do change. To the extent you can integrate those software systems that you do purchase so that they check in multiple times, or that at least that you check if you do it manually as an order comes in, so your salespeople know right up front whether they can proceed or how to proceed, and also before the shipment goes forward, because some things may have changed that you weren't aware of, and you're still responsible, throughout the transaction. Other considerations on your supply chain security, making sure you have documentation as who is responsible. Training is key, and having backups in place, because people will often be in training, or they'll be on travel, or they'll be on vacation. You want to make sure that there's some redundancy within your organization so that different folks can step up to do some of those screening and supply chain security activities, not just one individual. And the last bullet, I think, says it all. Audit, audit, audit. This is an area where there usually are, like in that little machine and that watch, there's a lot of moving parts in this supply chain security. You've got engineers that may be assisting in reviewing and classifying or placing a jurisdictional decision on things. You've got export control people. You've got your legal department. You've got your shipping department. You have a lot of different parts of it as far as supplying or applying for a license, obtaining it, following up with the conditions, the record keeping. So this is an area as far as auditing and reviewing this very often and detailed that is critical. Record keeping. This is something that is specifically identified in Part 762, and we probably went over it in some detail earlier this week, but the reason this specifically is in here is because of a couple of reasons. From our export enforcement side of the house, they've basically shared with us that this is an area where companies and organizations can basically tell their story and prove and show their due diligence to kind of, support mitigating factors if something did go wrong. So it's critical to be able basically to protect yourself and to say exactly what you did and when you did it, who did it, and here are records of that screening we did of that customer. Also, 762 of the Export Administration Regulations requires specific, and it details the specific items that you do need to maintain in your records and for what period of time, which is basically 5 years, but you got to be careful because it's 5 years from a specific last transaction or transshipment or re-export or resale that you're aware of or knowledgeable of. So you do need to be careful of that as far as working with your record management group, your IT professionals, as far as ensuring easy access to those records. And then as well, destruction requirements. If you have maintained stuff and you have no destruction schedule, even though you could have destroyed it, if export enforcement comes knocking on the door and you have some materials from 2001 there, even though you may not be required to keep them, and you go, wow, start destroying those, you can't. Export enforcement can obtain or request those once they come in and, find out or are aware that you do have information back from that length of time. So there's a lot of considerations in record keeping that from a compliance administrator standpoint, you put on those glasses or those lenses and look at it from that point of view. Think about the things you have to maintain and who in your organization that you need to work closely with to ensure that we can, obtain or produce these quickly, and I can do some audits and searches on them in a variety of different ways. But think as well of things that maybe not required by Part 762 that you want to maintain maybe for other reasons as far as telling your story or showing your due diligence, or just, for your own organization. You can go beyond the requirements of 762 if you need to. And as it says there in the fourth bullet, make sure you understand and know where the virtual or physical location of those records are kept. Look at the barriers, for managing your records. Everybody basically today almost becomes a small record manager in an organization. I have some things that in my Office of Exporter Services may be critical and important that I understand and need to know where that needs to be maintained and kept for a certain length of time. Additional considerations, as it says here, you got to have a backup, for your electronic files. And if those electronic files are original files, that is sufficient as far as the Export Administration regulations. It doesn't say you have to maintain them in paper. If the original file is in an electronic form, that is the original file. It does say that if we do request them in paper, that they can be put in paper if requested. That's not very often that happens. It's extremely rare, actually, but it could happen. So it needs to be able to, to do that. Making sure they're retrievable easy, as that second bullet says, is important. Just for you as well as a compliance person, if you're going to be doing audits in a number of different ways, that you may be looking at different sales people or sales regions or countries or different types of items that you export. So you want to be able to pull that up in different methods. Moving on to the last three, export compliance monitoring and auditing. Basically, we're talking about auditing here and how important that is. And I've kind of mentioned that previously as well, that auditing is where most folks begin to find out of potential vulnerabilities or issues that may have arisen over time that have kind of changed, like the path of a river. It kind of keeps bending along. After a while, it makes a new path. And maybe sometimes that's a better path. I mean, you may find out things where you want to update your procedures because your employees have found a better, more efficient or effective or faster way of doing certain of the procedural steps that you've put into place, which is a good thing, but often they may not come back. So you want to revise your overall manual and your training to meet the actual operational realities of how things are working in your organization at that point in time. But looking at this anatomy, as I mentioned before, on our website, you have an audit module in there to assist folks if you're doing it yourself internally. You have a lot of different things to think about, identifying, who the personnel in your business unit that are going to be interviewed, what you're going to obtain. Are you going to have a set of specifically responsive questions that you're going to ask each party? What are you going to look at before you even begin to do your audit? And making sure, as that fourth bullet says, that you don't just look at your export control people. You want to look at different layers up and across the horizon within your organization to make sure that they're covered as well. And here, when you get to the back end, this is something that we found kind of just on internally here as we've done some of our own audits, is to go back once you get a draft report to the folks where you find certain findings or recommendations to ensure that what you've captured is accurate, and you don't need to make some modifications before you send kind of a summary report and your final report up to senior management and other decision makers, so that you have that buy-in and understanding. It's also going to include oftentimes, some kind of corrective action or additional, training that might be necessary based on the findings that you make. The other thing I'd say is often in the course of human events, you've got a million things on your plate. This audit is just an additional thing. You need senior management support to ensure that you can clear your plate to some degree so that you have some time frame, 30, 60 days, or some finite time frame to complete your audit and your report so that it doesn't languish and move on over months and months, and maybe in some cases, dreadfully never gets done. And then once you obviously have that report, if you do have findings, you want to make sure those corrective actions are put into place on a timely basis. And if issues are found, you want to re-audit those and maybe not even wait a year to re-audit them to make sure that they're corrected, but a shorter period of time, maybe 30 or 60 days out, to see if those corrective actions took and are working properly. And then, again, do an audit maybe on an annual basis, although I know some larger companies that do it on a quarterly basis just because of their volume. Going now into basically I'm going to combine the 8th and 9th elements together because they are closely related. And these are elements, too, that I'd say a lot of folks give short drift to because they don't think they'll ever be in that boat. But we're all good people here. We're not going to have an export violation. I play softball with Tom. He's a good guy. He would never do anything wrong. And that's right. I am a good guy, and I wouldn't do anything wrong. But I could mess up. I could have an oops. I could make a mistake or miss something, maybe not follow a procedure. And so things do happen, and you have to have some written procedures or some kind of policies and instructions of what you're going to do if things are identified, a vulnerability or potential violation. So let's talk about these two. And I'd say this, too, for an export administrator, this may be your best protection, too, as far as following a specific set of guidelines that management has adopted and signed off on if there is an issue. And first, as I said before, kind of having a no-fear environment that employees have the right confidence and conscience to do the right thing, to speak up and share it with the export compliance folks or legal department or whomever that is, to say that there's something that they think isn't just right. And that can be just a small thing or, maybe even larger. And think about it in two ways, too, because it really is two steps. First, internal. You first need to identify, Houston, do we have a problem first? Is there a violation? So you have to have a mechanism for an internal notification as to who this goes to. And if you're in a larger organization, I'd really recommend that it would go to more of like a compliance team, if you will, or a corporate compliance council. So you have a larger group that can kind of weigh in and review and clear to say we don't have a problem, this is an issue, here's how we resolved it, and take care of it that way. If you do have a singular person who's maybe also the same person who is in charge of compliance, there could be a perception or a potential for some sweeping it under the rug and saying, oh, I've taken care of that, don't worry about it, it wasn't a violation, and maybe it was. So you want to have maybe a kind of a corporate counsel, or think of something like that for an internal notification process. Make sure, as it says, that people know where to go and how to report such things that they think might be a violation or could be a vulnerability, or they see some red flags in a transaction. Who do I go to? Who do I report this to? I just want to do the right thing. Have it available on different things, posters, wallet size cards, things like that. Again, more considerations on the internal notification is to have the kind of the small investigation process of how that's going to be handled, laid out before you, and how it's going to be resolved. Make sure you get back to the employee that reported the issue in the first place. Oftentimes people get a little bit antsy or concerned if they say something and weeks go by and they never hear back. Are we doing the right thing? What's going on? So have a mechanism to make sure you get back to to employees in your organization. External notification. Okay, if the cop holding out his hand there is there, and he's kind of found out through your corporate counsel or whatever that, it looks like we actually had an oops and we apparently have an export that needed a license, that didn't have one, or we didn't do a particular action that we were supposed to by regulation, and we now have to make that external notification. Again, this is kind of the second part. Now I've got to get back to consider making a voluntary self-disclosure, which I would highly encourage you to do. It's just the right thing to do to take care of it. There's just so many different mechanisms and reporting things out there and information that export enforcement or others can become aware of violations even after the fact. And if they do, it's not handled as nicely administratively as voluntary self-disclosure, which over 90% of those are closed out with a warning letter or just an educational letter, and that's it, with no administrative fines at all. And that in itself, even if there is an administrative fine, is a mitigating factor in itself that you made a voluntary self-disclosure. A key thing is to make sure you centralize communication. I've seen it in my time with enforcement where we'll get a letter maybe first from somebody from the general counsel of company A, and then a month later we get another letter from maybe the CEO of company A. Well, it begins to be a little confusing to the government as to make sure who's the main speaker for the disclosure, and so centralize those communications. Definitely identify if other violations exist, because certainly the government's going to do that. Once they come in and start to identify those types of transactions, they're going to look to see if there's any others. So you want to do that as well. At the same time, you want to make that disclosure as quickly as possible so you get credit for it. So as I've advised, and I've heard my enforcement colleagues as well, if you need to make an initial voluntary self-disclosure and say, in 30 days we'll make kind of a final disclosure, but we're currently, taking an assessment to see if there's any other issues related to this that we need to make you aware of, and we will send the same one, send it from the same person, but just, title it as such and send that in so you get credit for being a voluntary self-disclosure. Make sure you identify mitigating factors. I mean, this is your chance. I mean, you want to say, hey, Mom, Dad, yeah, I broke the window, but here's the thing, my sister was bothering me, so I threw the bat at her and I went by her, and but she started it. Maybe that's not the best example, but here's your opportunity. You want to say, we've got an export management compliance program, we've got all the 9 elements, we've implemented them, and this is the reason that this happened. And so this is your opportunity to press those mitigating factors in your disclosure. You want to make sure that you bring those forward. Okay, we're kind of now at the end. We've gone through these 9 elements. You've got them. Maybe you have a 10th. Take a step back from it, because if you're just starting, maybe you don't have a written manual at all, and you're saying, wow, this is a lot. You don't want to try to eat this submarine sandwich in one bite. You want to take little bites, a little bit at a time. Prioritize, take stock first of kind of where you are now and where you want to be. Think about building a team. Who can be on this team with me? Who would be advantageous? Who are the stakeholders inside of my organization that can help me, that I'll need in sales, in the traffic department, in shipping, in human resources, in our loss, and our attorneys, and senior management? You're going to need those folks to help kind of design and to develop and improve and enhance your program. So take it in small bites as you go forward and kind of focus on your policies, your operational guidelines, and developing that, and then just continue to improve and evolve and build on it, and just think it through. And if you need help, we are available on that website I showed you earlier. If you have a draft export management compliance program, you want Tom Androkonis and company to review it and give you, just from us to you, some feedback, suggestions. We're, glad to do that. You can send them through us in the website, and we do that as well. So let me stop at that point and thank everybody for the great attention. And I will turn it back to Linda now so we can open it up for some questions.
Great. At this time,
Thank you, Tom. Yes, now we'll open it for voice questions.
At this time, if you would like to ask a question, please press *1. Please make sure you unmute your phone and record your name when prompted so I may introduce your question. And if you'd like to remove your question at any time, you may press *2.
with a couple of written questions that we have from our audience. I'll start from the first question from Josh Nesseldreyer. Will you make the presentation available to the audience? Yes, the presentation is available right now. If you go onto your computer on the upper right-hand side, you'll see an icon, which looks like it's about 3 pieces of paper. One is overlapping the other two. If you place your mouse's cursor over that icon and just click on it, you will find these PowerPoint presentation slides. There's a little box on the left-hand side. Just take your mouse's cursor and click on that box. There should be a check mark, and then it'll give you an option on the right-hand side to download that to your computer, or you can download it to any other folder that's also in your computer. Let's go to the next question I have from Christina Martin. Based on BIS statistics, what percentage of violations are related to the IT exports, especially software?
In answer to your question, Christina, this is Tom. There are a number of violations that we've had over the years that deal with software exports. We get a large number of voluntary self-disclosures in that area. I don't have a specific percentage that I can quote you off the top of my head. I think in our annual report, and if you look at the export enforcement cases, you could kind of almost ballpark, because they'll identify all of our significant cases from the previous year, how many deal in the area of IT or software. I don't have that. Our export enforcement folks might have that, but I'm not sure, so I can't answer that with a specific percentage for you in that regard. But if you look at the Don't Let This Happen to You, you may see some good examples that might be advantageous, to you on your end there.
Thank you, Tom. There's no more questions, but I'm going to, on the written part, but we are always open for voice questions, so I'll bring it back to the operator to see if the audience has any voice questions.
And there are no audio questions at this time.
Okay, we did get a couple more written ones. Let's go to the next question from Patty Yao. Can you please explain what sort of information is the email notification services from BIS?
Okay, Patty, there's a couple of different email notification services that are available from BIS. You can go onto our website and sign up for email notification of our seminars that we're having across the United States or anywhere, and then you will be updated on those. You can also sign up for notification of regulatory changes to the Export Administration regulations. So as we issue a new Federal Register that impacts the EAR or updates it in any way, you can get an email notification of that as well, which if you're the export person, the stuckee, if you will, at your organization, I would highly recommend anybody to get that, because you're going to get that immediately. And it's good to know if we're out in your neck of the woods, as far as seeing what seminar that might be helpful to you or your staff to attend, and or just the regulatory updates.
Great. Thank you, Tom. Next question here is from Jeff Stow. Would the elements of a compliance program change at all in the context of an academic institution? There seems to be a general perception that almost all research at an institution that by policy refuses to engage in classified research falls within exception under EAR.
This is a good question, Jeff, and we just did a seminar right here in Arlington, last month, where it dealt with deemed exports, technology transfers, and we had specific areas dealing with for universities. And you're correct that I've gotten a lot of questions from universities and labs that says your elements seem to be more geared to kind of the straight manufacturer exporter. How do they kind of crosswalk over into the educational community? It does take, they still do, it does take a little bit of not interpretation, but you've got to think about who then becomes the senior management. Is it the provost? Is it the president of the university? How is that training then conducted, and who needs to obtain training on export controls within that, as far as bringing in foreign students that are working on specific types of maybe research that could be export controlled that aren't fundamental research. So you do need to think about that. There are a few examples. The Dr. Roth case at the University of Tennessee, that's out on our website as far as how that came to kind of closing. And there was a Texas Tech professor as well. And I know from talking with our universities that it is a different world. A professor who's in charge of the physics department is almost, he or she is like their own, God, that they, move in a different plane. And for an administrator or somebody else in a different, to try to get their buy-in, their commitment, you really need that from up top. But all of those elements you can walk over as far as, all those different areas of doing audits and doing training and doing and having a written compliance program. Maybe to some degree a little bit different as far as getting the overall corporate culture of commitment and, understanding it. We do have a lot of committees right now working on, with universities, with the Bureau of Industry and Security, to identify those technologies that are most sensitive to perhaps revise our export control kind of lay of the land of what would be controlled. We do have the fundamental research kind of, escape hatch, which often comes into place, but not always, because you're exactly right. And I think I see it from kind of your question that there are certain situations that fall beyond that aren't going to be published or maybe being worked with another agency, the Department of Defense or somebody else. I think I partially answered your question and not completely. So if you need to follow up, feel free to, call me or email me afterwards. But let's see if we've got a few more questions that we can get to.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tom. Next question here is from Greg Stam. Will certificate of attendance be issued for this 9-webinar series on BIS ERR training? We're not an academic institution. The government does not, at least on the webinar part, we do not give out a certificate of any sort. EIS, I don't know if there are conferences or there are seminars that they do issue certificates, but for the webinar, this webinar series, unfortunately, we do not. Okay,
but I have to look into it.
I talked to Angela Robinson, who has helped develop the content for this webinar series, and she is the person that you should ask Greg to see about a certificate. She has to investigate this to see if on the BIS side that they do issue certificates for attending if you did attend the series. But from the webinar portion, usually with webinars, it's really not something that we issue certificate. But please contact Angela, and Angela is on this hotline, this expert counseling line at 202-482-4811. So, Greg, we can answer your question at that phone number. I'll go to the last question that we have from Mona Karwandi. Forgive me if I didn't answer or pronounce that last name right. If you export items that are controlled, do you have to screen the potential customers before they are approached by the sales team?
This is a good question, Mona. This is something where you really need to make your own business decision as to what makes the most sense. To me, I would definitely screen potential customers very early because you don't want to expend a lot of energy or time of your sales staff, let's say, and if the long shot, but potential, let's say a customer that's a denied person or sanctioned and they can't receive items and your sales staff has expended some time and energy and they find out later from you, Mona, oh, you can't deal with them. It's like, oh my gosh, I thought I had the sale of the century here. This is a shame. Or maybe they're a listed entity where you could maybe supply the order, but it may be a case-by-case basis, so it could be a yes or a no, and you're not sure. And your sales team, the sooner they know that, the better for them as far as working with your customers. So they're very honest and, just, telling them the way things are that, I do, for this item, it is controlled. I need to obtain a license or, maybe it can go by your license determination under a license exception like GBS. Well, even still, there's some parameters there that you need to understand who the customer is, what they're using it for. It's not going to be used for any Part 744 weapons of mass destruction development or things like that. So normally their sales staff need to be aware of the red flags and knowledgeable of those as they work with their customers to better serve them and support them and deliver on a timely basis.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Thomas. Everyone, I'm afraid that is close to an ending to the time of our presentation. Now remember, for those of you who do have questions later on after this presentation, please note Thomas Androukonis' contact information. Once again, his telephone number is 202-482-6393. You can also reach him by email. He's generously given out his email at tandruko@bis.doc.gov. Also, please check out the Bureau of Industry and Security's website at www.bis.doc.gov, where you can get more information on these topics as well as other information on these regs. Also, please contact the www.export.gov, which is the U.S. Commercial Services website, where you can find more information about upcoming webinars and events. Thank you to all of our participants. Thank you, Tom, for your expertise and your presentation. Thank you, Angela, for developing this series of the Bureau of Industry and Security's Export Administration regulations. And everyone, please check your email boxes for more information on upcoming webinars. Goodbye.